Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 25 March 2025. It is the 119th anniversary of the birth of Alan John Percivale Taylor, better known to posterity as AJP Taylor, who was born in Birkdale, England, 119 years ago on this date in 1906. AJP Taylor is most widely known for his controversial book, The Origins of the Second World War, originally published in 1961. Even the historiography of the book itself is conflicted. Paul Weibel wrote, quote, "It was lavishly praised. Taylor was compared with Macaulay and Gibbon and praised for his methodical and impeccable logic," unquote. But Robert Cole wrote, quote, Critics, critics spoke against the book in a blitz of protest that was often harsh and acrimonious, unquote. When Taylor published The Origins of the Second World War, it was just over 20 years since the war began, and less than 20 years since the war had ended. So when the book appeared, the war wasn't yet relegated to the distant past, but was still in living memory. Now we're almost 100 years past the Second World War, but it's still an open wound on history, and the forces that caused the war are still at work in history today. We know this because the chattering classes can never stop drawing parallels between the events of the war and the lead up to the war and events in the present. In other words, the Second World War is still present for us. It's the lens through which we view our own present, even though most of us today weren't alive for any of it. One way to understand the hold that the Second World War has over contemporary thought is to see it as a model for an international crisis leading to war. And here I'm using model in the narrow sense that I used the term in my episode on Schopenhauer, in which I argued that Schopenhauer took the history of Herodotus as a categorical expression of history and all the history you need to know. Today, the Second World War is treated as a categorical expression of political crisis and war, and all events in the present are made to fit the Procrustean bed of the Second World War. Schopenhauer said that if you'd read Herodotus, you know enough history. In the same spirit, we could say that the contemporary attitude is that if you know the Second World War, you know enough about war. I'm not suggesting that this is a good way to make use of the historical record of the war, only that this is a common way of looking at it today. The Second World War isn't a part of my living memory, but both of my parents were of an age to remember the war, so I was exposed firsthand to the living memory of the war through them, and part of my understanding of the war is derived from the stories they told me about their experiences during and after the war. The personal stories we hear fill in unlikely details here and there that would never appear in a history book, and these details give us a personal insight into events that we wouldn't otherwise possess. Sometimes diaries and letters can give us this kind of insight into event, and historians draw from these sources as they are available. But even here, it's not quite the same thing as hearing it from someone you know, since that experience of hearing a story from someone who experienced it gives us details that can't be captured in words. The tone of voice and the expression on someone's face tells you what it was like to live through the events in question, the lived experience of events, if you will. On top of viewing the Second World War as a categorical expression of world crisis, we're also still trying to work through the consequences of the war. That is to say, we still live in the post-war world. However, dramatically history has changed from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the United States passing through its unipolar moment and now passing beyond that unipolar moment as the world shifts back to multipolarity and history in the large is once again being driven by great power politics. It was the settlement of the Second World War that left the US and the USSR as the two superpowers whose competition would dominate the 20th century. And now, a quarter of the way through the 21st century, it's still the US and Russia that project power on a planetary scale. These observations are intended to place Taylor's book in the relevant context so we can understand its influence and the controversy around it. And Taylor's book wasn't the only controversial book that was stirring up public reaction to the Second World War at the time. Hannah Arendt had obtained press credentials to attend the trial of Adolf Eichmann, which was held in 1961, the same year Taylor's book came out in England. The Origins of the Second World War was published in the U.S. in 1962, after Eichmann's trial but before his execution. Arendt's reportage of the trial appeared first serialized in the New Yorker in 1963, and then in book form later the same year with a revised and expanded edition in 1964. Arendt couldn't have avoided hearing about the controversy surrounding Taylor's The Origins of the Second World War while she was attending the Eichmann trial and later when she was writing up the experience into her book Eichmann in Jerusalem. Both of these books stirred up renewed debate about the Second World War, and both could be considered revisionary historiography. We often hear of some work of history being called revisionary, but what exactly does this mean? Historical revisionism is the reinterpretation of an historical event or events that differs in some important respect from received or established interpretations. Obviously, there's rarely any monolithic interpretation of an historical event, and any event as large and as complicated as the Second World War will have a great many interpretations. So the identification of historical revisionism in regard to the Second World War is going to be relative to a community that assumes a certain orthodox interpretation, even though many outside that community will have a different interpretation of events. And it's not difficult at all to find alternative interpretations of the Second World War. If you visit the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, which I have, you can see for yourself the Japanese interpretation of the Second World War. If you brought in American historians to redesign the Japanese exhibits, this would be historical revisionism for the Japanese, but the establishment of historical orthodoxy for the Americans. But you can also visit the Hiroshima Memorial, where I've also been, and there you'll find the presentation of events isn't all that different from what you'll find in contemporary Western scholarship. While a lot of Western scholars would reject the Japanese account of the origins of the Second World War, at least in the Pacific theater, many Western scholars today are sympathetic to Japanese accounts of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I recently listened to Susan Neiman's book, Evil and Modern Thought, in which the author recounts her own changing views of the atomic bombings, which could be interpreted as a shift from an orthodox history of the decision to drop the atomic bombs to a revisionary view of this decision. Usually a conversion of this kind from an orthodox historical interpretation to a revisionist interpretation is a result of an individual believing themselves to have come to a better understanding of events than that which they had previously held, so that the previous interpretation is seen as benighted, while the revisionary view is seen as enlightened. It's easy to find insulting characterizations of both orthodox views of historical events and revisionary views of historical events. Orthodox views, when they're being criticized, are called official or status quo or establishment or even establishmentarian. Revisionary views, when they're being criticized, are called marginal or are said to constitute negationism or denialism. Today, we might even call revisionary views conspiracy theories until they're proved to be correct 6 months later. All of these have become loaded terms employed as a demarcation between one's previously benighted views and one's current enlightened views. So if we call Taylor's book an example of historical revisionism, or if we call Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, an example of historical revisionism, we have to understand that it was a challenge to the historical orthodoxy of the Anglosphere in 1961. And as we saw with Arendt's book that appeared just after Taylor's book, this was a time of reassessment of the Second World War. Taylor was concerned to refute what has come to be called the Nuremberg Thesis, and this was a source of his revisionism. Taylor himself doesn't refer to the Nuremberg Thesis in the Origins of the Second World War, but he does refer to the Nuremberg outlook. We could define the Nuremberg Thesis as the view that the leaders of Germany engaged in a conspiracy to wage aggressive warfare against the other states of Europe, and that this was the primary cause of the war. The Robert Cole paper I quoted earlier calls this idea the war guilt consensus, which is an equally accurate label. The strongest formulation of the Nuremberg Thesis would be that the decision of war leaders, German leaders, to wage war was the exclusive and sole cause of the war, and no other factors played a role. A corollary of Taylor's critique of the Nuremberg Thesis is that the Second World War wasn't purposefully planned, but was the result of a series of blunders. And I'll return to this idea in what follows. Part of the reason this idea has come to be called the Nuremberg Thesis is that the Nuremberg Thesis came to be the operating presumption of the Nuremberg tribunals in the consequence of the war. Because of the international nature of the prosecutors at the tribunal, it wasn't considered politic at the time to mention actions by other nation states that could be interpreted as contributing to the outbreak of the war. So no one, for example, brought up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the division of Poland. The Nuremberg tribunals needed the Nuremberg Thesis, if only implicit at the time, to prosecute the German leadership while leaving the Allies unscathed, and the Nuremberg Thesis itself needed an historical context to supply its legitimacy. This historical context was furnished by what is called Sonderweg, which is German for special path or separate path, meaning that the German people had a distinctive history that differentiated them from the rest of Europe. If we liked, we could call this German exceptionalism by analogy with American exceptionalism, which shows the German special path in a wider historical context in which other peoples are also recognized as historical exceptions. But Sonderweg is the familiar term in this context, so that's what I'll use here. There's an interesting 2015 paper, The Genesis of the Sonderweg, by Annie Everett, which discusses the idea of a Sonderweg both before and after the Second World War. Ultimately, Everett argues that the Sonderweg idea was primarily a product of the Weimar Republic as a response to German problems of the 1920s, but she also discusses antithetical valuations of the Sonderweg, either as being a wonderful thing or as being a terrible thing. What I find to be truly strange about the Sonderweg idea is the implicit presupposition that German history deviated from a norm of European history. This seems to me to be a remarkable claim that would require an especially robust philosophy of history to defend. If there were a generic template of European, I should say, is there or was there a generic template of European history from which German history diverged? I think it'd be very difficult to make this argument since the histories of France, Italy, Spain, England, the Low Countries, and Central Europe are all quite different from one another. And it would take some really inventive arguments to try to show, for example, that the Balkans and the Iberian Peninsula had essentially the same history with some differences that can be waved away as mere contingencies. Further, this seems to imply a pretty strongly nomothetic conception of history, according to which large geographical areas obey the same laws of historical development from end to end. I suspect, though I can't prove, that when the Sonderweg is invoked, it's primarily the history of France that historians have in mind and want to compare to the history of Germany. But even if we allow this restriction, it's not all that much better. France and Germany have radically different histories. Since the end of Roman power in the West, France has always been the most unified and centralized of all the regimes of Western Europe, and Germany has arguably been the most fragmented, with the most of its history being the Holy Roman Empires of the German people, which was a grand name for a patchwork of political entities that knew neither unity nor centralization. Should we regard French history as a norm for Europe and view any divergent from this French norm as a Sonderweg? Would we really wish upon the Germans that they had experienced the Germanic equivalent of the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, and Napoleon? It's hard for me to imagine that anyone would take this seriously, which is probably why no one makes all this explicit. The alternative to the implicit and nomothetic account of a norm of European history from which Germany on its Sonderweg diverged would presumably be the idea that there is no norm for European history and that history is merely contingent or a series of accidents. And here, too, we find an interpretation of Taylor's work. The paper by Paul Weibel that I quoted earlier is titled The Taylor Thesis, which he identifies as the view of history, which he identifies as the view that history is accidental. The idea here that Taylor, in arguing against the Nuremberg Thesis, was more generally impugning all attempts at historical explanation that involve purposeful planning, or what Mircea Eliade called being consciously and voluntarily historical. In this way, Taylor's thesis is the repudiation of Eliade's historical man. But just as I said earlier that there's a strong form of the Nuremberg Thesis according to which the plans of Germany's leaders were the sole cause of the Second World War, so too we can distinguish a strong and a weak form of Taylor's thesis. The weakest form is simply the rejection of the Nuremberg Thesis, whereas the strong form is what Cole calls Taylor's thesis. I don't think that Taylor had anything like the strong form of the Taylor thesis in mind when he wrote The Origins of the Second World War. But whether or not Taylor had anything like this in mind, it's admittedly convenient to have a label for Taylor's thesis for an idea that has also been called Cleopatra's nose. This is a reference to the possibility that had Cleopatra's nose not been as attractively shaped as it was in fact, she wouldn't have been able to seduce both Caesar and Mark Antony and therefore change the direction of history. It was Pascal who wrote, quote, "The nose of Cleopatra, if it had been shorter, the whole face of the earth would have been changed," unquote. I said that I don't think Taylor had any generalization of his repudiation of the Nuremberg Thesis in mind, so that there's no implicit convergence on a philosophy of history either as a norm or as a mere sequence of accidents. Given the views of most professional historians, which are, I think, well expressed by Geoffrey Elton's objection to what he called thesis-dominated history, this is what I would expect from most historians, Taylor included. That is to say that they wouldn't have in mind any strong version of something like the Nuremberg Thesis. According to Elton, the Nuremberg Thesis or its rejection ought to be conceived as something peculiar to a particular milieu, and it's intended as an explanation only for a particular time and place. In his criticism of thesis-dominated history, Elton presumes what I would call an ideographic imperative in history. This ideographic imperative is nicely illustrated by Isaiah Berlin, who often insisted on this point, although I'm calling it the ideographic imperative. That's not something that Berlin said. But Berlin did write, quote, "When I read about Robespierre or Napoleon, I do not wish to be told what it is that Napoleon had in common with all other adventurers or with all other emperors. I do not wish to know exactly how Robespierre resembled all other lawyers and revolutionaries. What I wish to discover is that which is uniquely important and characteristic of these two men. I want Robespierre and his life and character and acts brought to life before me in their unique individuality. When I read about the French Revolution or the Renaissance, I'm interested only in a minor way in what these great episodes of human civilization had in common with developments in Babylon or among the Aztecs. This may be of interest to sociologists, or it may indeed be intrinsically illuminating, but the business of historians is to convey differences more than similarities, to paint a portrait of a unique, absolutely specific set of events and persons," unquote. Suffice it to say, this isn't my view of history, even if the ideographic imperative is the view of most historians. If you like, you could use this as a demarcation criterion between genuine historians and mere pretenders. Just as no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge, no true historian would be interested in what all revolutionaries have in common. This would mean that I'm not a true historian, since I am interested in what all revolutionaries have in common. I'm also interested in why historians make the claims that they do, and looking at the Nuremberg Thesis or its repudiation through the lens of Elton's rejection of thesis-dominated history offers an interesting insight into historical thought. Elton carved out an exemption for his singular historical theses, so that, for example, Hugh Trevor Roper's general crisis of the 17th century was fine as long as it was limited to 17th century Europe, or Gilbert Murray's failure of nerve thesis was acceptable as long as it was only applied to late antiquity, and Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis was acceptable as long as it was confined to the American frontier in the 19th century. The Nuremberg Thesis, taken in the spirit of Geoffrey Elton's singular exemptions, as I have suggested it should be taken, is a singular claim about the origins of the Second World War, not generalizable to the origins of other wars. The repudiation of the Nuremberg Thesis, as in Taylor's book, is also a singular thesis, not generalizable to other times or places, and therefore not generalizable as the strong form of the Taylor thesis. From a philosophical standpoint, what's interesting in this is that Elton's exemption carved out for singular theses is equivalent to the generalization that historical theses cannot be generalized. Being itself a generalization, this generalization of non-generalization is viciously circular, undercutting itself and making Elton's position, which I've suggested is a common position of historians, incoherent. I could formulate my own thesis and claim that history is an engine for producing incoherence. We can imagine, for example, an historian making the argument or implying the argument that history is not accidental, that the Taylor thesis, with the rejection of the Nuremberg thesis nested inside it, requires that history be accidental. Therefore, the Taylor thesis is wrong, and therefore the Nuremberg thesis must be correct. This isn't a valid argument, but a lot of what passes for theory in history isn't valid, which is precisely why many historians like Elton get very prickly around theories and dismiss them out of hand. But we're not historians, we're philosophers of history, and theories of history are our bread and butter. Far from dismissing theories of history, we put them front and center. For us, it would be intensely interesting to know if either Taylor's thesis or its negation are true, or if the Sonderweg thesis implies a historical norm as the counterpart to divergence from the norm is true. More than interesting, it might be actionable knowledge that could provide a program for being, as Eliade put it, consciously and voluntarily historical. We aren't obligated to accept any of these theses or their negations, and we certainly ought to be suspicious of any of them stated in their pure form. But we should try to understand them so we can understand what the alternatives might be. Later this year, I'm hoping to produce another episode on Reinhard Koselleck, and in that episode, I'll try to show some of the ways that the forces of history that produced the world wars of the 20th century are historical forces that led to the French Revolution and which are still playing out in the world today. In this way, the origins of the Second World War would be neither a matter of blundering into war, according to the Taylor thesis, or a matter of carefully planned conspiracy to wage aggressive warfare, according to the Nuremberg thesis, but could be assimilated to a more orderly process of causality, such as we apply to other historical events. And several philosophers have discussed the relevance of Taylor's work to the problem of historical causality. For example, William Drey considers this in his paper, A Controversy Over Causes, AJP Taylor and the Origins of the Second World War. Also, Mark Day, in his book, The Philosophy of History and Introduction, discusses Taylor's view of historical causation. But I think I've said enough about Taylor for the time being. If fate is kind to me and I'm around next year to produce another episode on Taylor, maybe I'll talk about the relevance of his work to historical causality. In the meantime, happy birthday, AJP Taylor, and thanks for listening.